I actually think the Rwanda policy was right.
Yes.
If Friedrich Merz wanted Boris Johnson to come and outline how migration policy could work, then I'm sure Boris would only be too happy to oblige. Well, that just proves that he's a dick.
Yeah, thank you.
I think, in essence, what we have is climate change concerns having emerged from science. They became a religion.
I think that the period of peak net zero was actually a period of mania in our politics. I would compare it to lockdown fervour and the Black Lives Matter period as well.
My name is Michael Gove and I'm editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
And this week on Quite Right, we'll be examining Shabana Mahmood's barnstorming performance in the House of Commons as she introduces her asylum proposals.
We'll also be discussing the COP30 summit and specifically the lack of interest in this year's festivities.
And we'll be considering the curious case of Adolf Hitler's DNA. This week, the government newsmaker has actually been responsible for a story the government wants us to be talking about. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has unveiled a set of new proposals to try to restrict the demand for asylum in the United Kingdom. And she lit up the House of Commons by taking down her opponents from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, attracting certainly some rave reviews from those on the right, who you'd normally expect to be critical of a Labour government. Maddie, do you believe that Shabana Mahmood has effectively established the case for what it is that she's trying to do and the case for her as a star of this government?
Well, I think she really has. It was a really interesting experience to watch in the chamber, a minister giving such a self-assured performance. Unlike many of her colleagues, what she said with real conviction. You sense that maybe she was doing a good performance, but it came across as authentic and genuine in a way that I think people have really lacked with this administration and with many others. So there was that element of it. It was rather glorious, I think, to see her taking on many of the kind of usual suspects in the chamber, not just from her own party, people like Nadia Whittome. You know, there's this great wailing and gnashing of teeth from the sort of awkward squad bench of the Labour backbenchers. Nadia called it an act that flies in the face of decency and compassion. And she even took on the Greens, which I particularly enjoyed, by pointing out that although they are the first to hand-wring about the plight of migrants, they usually vote against any asylum accommodation in their area. So in that sense, she performed extremely well. But it does pave the way of, I think, two questions. Firstly, is the plan workable? And secondly, will she be able to get it past her own MPs and her party?
Yes, and it was certainly, for anyone who enjoys hypocrisy being punctured, seeing Shabana Mahmood not only tell Carla Denyer, the Green Party MP for Bristol Central, that asylum was not a right-wing talking point, but in fact a genuine crisis. That was refreshing. But what was even more enjoyable was, as you say, she pointed out the hypocrisy of Carla Denyer, having lovely language on asylum seekers in the House of Commons, but in fact in her own constituency, opposing any accommodation for asylum seekers. And the Commons footage of Carla Denyer jumping up and down, you know, with this look of injured outrage on her face, it was a beautiful thing.
Glorious.
But you're right that the performative element of it, and I don't mean to take anything away from the sincerity of Shabana Mahmood's beliefs, but the performative element, the Commons drama, is exactly, I think, what she would have wanted, which is to position herself as someone doing something that does provoke ire from the left within her own party and more broadly. But the proposals themselves have also come under a degree of, not criticism, but certainly a degree of scrutiny from people who wonder, is the model that she's invoked, Denmark, actually one that she's emulating? Is she going full Danish, as it were? And what she's seeking to do is to say that refugees will have temporary status. So, of course, if you're found to be someone who's genuinely seeking refuge, a genuine asylum seeker, that will allow you to be in the country, but it will be temporary. and it will be reviewed with a view to looking to see whether or not the country from which you fled is safe in the future. And also, one of the most vexed questions in migration, which is having arrived here, whether it's with refugee status or whatever, people then going on effectively to become permanent residents. She's also seeking to tackle by saying that people will have to wait 20 years before they can apply for permanent settlement. And she's also saying that countries which have not accepted people back who are genuinely not asylum seekers, 3 African countries she's identified, will suffer. Their citizens won't get visas to the UK, for example. So those are all significant steps in attempting to stem the flow, but they don't go as far as Denmark itself has done.
One thing that has kind of memed its way into the coverage of this is the idea that Shabana Mahmood is going to start confiscating the jewellery of people who arrive. Even though on many occasions she ruled this out in the Commons, it seems to be something that has seeped into public consciousness because this is what happens in Denmark. And therefore the assumption is that we will be copying their policy directly, which may not in fact be the case.
You're right. I think that in drawing comparisons and inviting comparisons with Denmark, there's an advantage for the government, which is that you have a social democratic leader who's marginalised a populist party by being tough on migration. So it's naturally an appealing parallel. But in Denmark, they are much tougher. And in Denmark, they do confiscate or take property from people who are asylum seekers in order to ensure that the means of support for those asylum seekers is paid for by them, wherever possible, in extracting that property. But actually, the toughest aspect of Denmark's policy, I think, is not so much the approach towards migration, it's the approach towards integration. And the fact that in Denmark they have this so-called ghetto policy, but which in essence says that they will work to ensure that you cannot have concentrations of explicitly non-European people in particular areas. Now, this is really tough stuff, and it would be very, very difficult to see that applied to places like Birmingham, Leicester, Blackburn, because of the patterns of migration that have occurred in this country for longer than migration has been an issue in Denmark, because of our past migration policies that we've had since 1948.
Yeah.
So, there is a sense in which Denmark sets a bar, particularly on integration, that we're, I think, extremely unlikely, certainly under a Labour government, to attempt to clear. But it does also leave open the question.
It'll be interesting to see what Lord Herman made of these.
Well, quite. But it does leave a broader question, which is, if it's the case that migration flows are reduced, then you've still got an integration question in the UK. And I think that Shabana Mahmood is actually brave enough to attempt to investigate and talk about this question because it matters to her for all sorts of reasons that divisions that could be generated by or within existing communities be addressed. But I think it will be very, very difficult for her because it involves, again, breaching certain taboos on the left. But unless you have a moderate, for want of a better word, Labour government or left-wing government addressing some of those, then what you get is the increased polarisation, the increased sense of identity politics, the increased sense of tribalism that works precisely against the sort of Britain that Shabana Mahmood says that she believes in.
Well, the one thing the one criticism I would have made of what I saw yesterday was that I thought that Shabana Mahmood's tone was a bit too triumphalist,
yes,
and potentially a bit too cocky for one who has not yet implemented her policy. And in particular, she was very quick to have a go at any Conservative who criticised her by reminding them of the failure of the Rwanda policy. But the failure of the Rwanda policy also proves that getting stuff off the ground is extremely difficult. And you find a lot of inbuilt obstruction from the legal system, and all sorts of other areas of the British state. And I also think that, perhaps she should enter into this with a little more humility, given that it's already made mincemeat of her predecessors.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Rwanda has become almost a sort of an emblem in the eyes of some for migration policy failure. I actually think the Rwanda policy was right.
Yes.
I think that the principle...
And many countries that have a functioning system of returns are, or at least many other countries in Europe are now trying to find some version of Rwanda.
I remember when I was still in government going to a conference in Cambridge where we had representatives from the German Christian Democrats. And one of the Christian Democrats there said, we're going to have to make sure that we have not just offshore processing, but that we have safe third countries to send people to, whether that's in Africa or elsewhere. And I said, so, a bit like the Rwanda policy. And he said, yes.
No, not like that.
This was before the Christian Democrats were actually back in government. And I said to him, and this was a conference which was stuffed full of European politicians, all of whom were, EU fans. I said, well, I can, because I know that he's at a bit of a loose end, ask a friend of mine who designed this policy for sending people to a safe third country to come and advise you. I think if Friedrich Merz wanted Boris Johnson to come and outline how migration policy could work, then I'm sure Boris would only be too happy to oblige. And the faces of the various...
Top trolling, though.
The faces of the
Must
various
have enjoyed that.
Europhile Christian Democrats there fell. But the point is that Boris and Suella and the others who championed and shaped the Rwanda policy were ahead of their time, because the nature of migration flows and the need to have safe third countries is clear. And whatever you think of Rwanda, it is one of the safest countries in Africa. It is the Singapore of Africa, as it were. I'm not holding it up as a democratic beacon, but the objections that were made to the Rwanda policy were, I think, the last dying cries of those who are living in a world before mass migration has manifestly caused so many of the challenges that it is now causing. And do you think, therefore, Maddie, that in a way there's a risk for Shabana Mahmood in that the level of expectation that she's generated amongst the public in particular is higher than this government's ability to actually restrict the flow?
Yeah, well, I think right now she's getting plaudits from the right-leaning press especially, and even from members of the opposition who genuinely wish her well in her endeavour, because even if they were to take over, it would give them a decent start to what the long-term goal is. So there's that element. But I do worry that the amount of trailing of this in particular, and of course Labour MPs haven't had a fantastic amount to shout about. This comes after weeks of perhaps the most chaotic preamble to a budget that I can ever remember. The amount of crazy policies that have been leaked and trailed. And of course, within a few days, the cycle will be back to that speculation. So this may feel like a kind of brief moment of triumph, but before it's followed up by reality. And fundamentally, the policy doesn't address, I think, two things that will be very important. Firstly, it's obviously looking at asylum, so it's not looking at legal migration, which is also a source of disenchantment to the British public. But it's fundamentally not revisiting the essential paradigms on which immigration policy is based. It's not looking at the charters governing our asylum obligations, for example. So there's a danger that, as with previous governments, it's that tough talk that is actually followed up by nothing much tangible. And even if it is a success in the long term, people perhaps will expect results sooner than they are likely to see. So maybe there's an expectation management problem there too.
I think that Shabana Mahmood is going about as far as almost any Labour minister could at this point, given the constraints of the Labour Party. So you are right that in order to deal with the problem, Reform and the Conservatives have argued that we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights and denounce various other international treaties and conventions with regard to torture, for example, and so on, in order to make sure that we have total control of our borders, or insofar as it's possible to exercise total control. And obviously, that will be crossing several red lines that Labour has constructed for itself, breaking taboos, which the party has made central, certainly under Keir Starmer, but for some years now, to its self-conception. Within those limits, then I think that she has gone quite far, and you can tell that from the reaction from some, most recently Alf Dubs, who has almost sort of godlike status within Labour as himself a child refugee who stood up for the rights of asylum seekers. So The fact that he's unhappy will trouble the consciences of some, but reassure those who believe that it's important to show the public that they understand. But the critical thing is, while we can observe the discontent in Westminster or the anticipation amongst some, it will be the public that will judge.
Yes.
And it will be the flows and also the arrival of asylum seekers in their neighbourhoods that will affect whether or not this policy is seen to be successful.
I thought the way that she framed the issue fundamentally was really shrewd. She basically said that if we don't get this sorted now, then the country will be more divided, more toxic than ever. And if you don't like what I'm doing now, then, what replaces it will be significantly worse. And at times she kind of explicitly used the language of identity politics to silence her critics. So there was a moment where the Lib Dem spokesman, who came across as wonderfully kind of smug and oleaginous, Max Wilkinson is his name.
The MP for Cheltenham.
Yes, that chap. He
is smug.
He's
I don't
very
know if he's
smug.
oleaginous, but he is the king of smuggery.
I've disliked him ever since I saw him do an interview on GB News where he dismissed gender and biological sex issues as an issue of genitalia rather than, fundamental women's rights. So it's that classic kind of Lib Dem bro.
Well, that just proves that he's a dick.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, he is.
I hope listeners will forgive my vulgarity, but anyone who removed Alex Chalk, who is a hero from the House of Commons, deserves nothing but condemnation. But your broader point, I think, is right.
But what she said to Wilkinson was he had a go at her for using immoderate language without really saying what it was that she'd said that was so bad. It was more kind of vibes-based criticism. And then she said, unlike you, I actually have to be on the receiving end of racism that will probably increase if the toxicity increases. So actually, she's using the tools of identity politics to argue against her left-wing critics.
Completely, yes. I think it's vanishingly unlikely that anyone called Max has suffered from condescension, prejudice, or the sort of racism that Shabana Mahmood has faced. But you're right. She used that in order to not just deflect the criticism, but turn it round on him and basically say, look, matey, if you're going to come over all sententious on questions of racism, then walk in my shoes for a few days. And she was also right, I think, to say that this issue is one which is real. The asylum system is not working, is deeply concerning to many voters. And she has, as she said explicitly, and it's always dangerous when you use this language, but I think it's right in her case, a moral obligation to deal with it. And I think from her point of view, the sort of moral obligation, again, is threefold. One, a moral obligation to prevent this issue being exploited by those she sees as extremists, a moral obligation to do what she was elected to do, and a moral obligation to make government work, because, irrespective of whatever position you take on the appropriateness of the changes that she's making, the asylum system itself, the internal workings of the Home Office, are in a terrible state. And I know from the conversations that I've had with Shabana Mahmood in the past that one of the things that she absolutely detests is the idea that you should accept second best from government, from the administrative machine, that there is a real imperative on her part to be able to say that the money that taxpayers have extracted from them is being spent in a way which ensures the maximum efficiency. After the break, we'll be looking at another set of intellectual assumptions which once reigned supreme, but which are now coming under increasing and powerful assault.
Michael, this week and last week, the annual COP summit, I think we're now on COP 30, has been underway in Brazil. But not that you would necessarily have followed it very closely unless you were really paying attention, because it seems that the annual extravaganza has become less of a salient issue in politics.
Well, I think that the issue of how we tackle climate change has moved for a variety of reasons in the last few years. I think it was the case that in the sort of first 15 years of this century, There was growing concern articulated by people like Al Gore, embodied in the documentary work of people like David Attenborough, about the impact of climate change on our environment. And there were a set of assumptions within it. One, that man was contributing to climate change. Related to that man's contribution to climate change was dramatic, catastrophic, and required reversal. And related to that there was therefore an obligation on all of us to reduce carbon emissions urgently and in a way which would transform our economies in order to avert what was an inevitable catastrophe. Now, so many of the assumptions behind that, not that man contributes to climate change, but that from that simple fact, so much should flow. So many of those assumptions have come under sustained intellectual attack. And one of the things that has been most significant, I think, has been the fact that Bill Gates has argued that the catastrophism associated with climate change can't be justified, that action is required to deal with it, but that the COP process has led to economic choices being made that are self-harming for many countries. And you see that embodied in the example of the Brazilian government, the host of COP. You have Lula, this left-wing icon who's Brazil's current president, who is enjoying being feted on the one hand as a climate leader, but at the other level is also pressing ahead with the exploitation of fossil fuels in Brazil because he recognizes that it's necessary for the economic welfare of his country that it operates in that way. And I think, in essence, what we have is climate change concerns having emerged from science. They became a religion. And now we're seeing science again, and if you include the dismal science of economics, coming back to say, actually, these are not areas where you should banish dissent. Dissent, questioning, skepticism in the best sense of the word, is at the heart of science. And instead of having a race to see who can win the approval of Greta Thunberg, you should have an examination of evidence and consequence.
I think that the period of peak net zero was actually a period of mania in our politics. I would compare it to lockdown fervour and the Black Lives Matter period as well, in which there was a great deal of pressure on everyone at all levels to go all in on this ideology without questioning it at all. I noticed, for example, that the House style became to talk about not just global warming, but like a climate catastrophe or climate emergency or a climate crisis. You kind of had to talk in those terms. And it was difficult to address the issue with any kind of skepticism. And I feel like we have now passed that peak mania, but I'm not convinced it is recognised in our policies yet. You know, we still cleave to our net zero target. Ed Miliband is an unsackable minister. Clearly, his department was given a vast amount of money at a time of retrenchment to spend on all kinds of projects, which we have no idea if they're likely to be a success or to generate an income or not. I do think that there's been a slight problem in the mania that was underway in 2019, 2020. And of course, when Theresa May foolishly signed us up in the dying days of her premiership to the net zero target in the first place. The problem that every millenarian movement has is that they predict that the earth is going to be destroyed. They kind of over-egg the pudding so much, like they did with the ozone layer or, as you mentioned, the rising sea levels. And I think the way that they choose to sell the policies has been catastrophic, both in the overselling, but also the element of rank hypocrisy that accompanies it. You know, the highway through the Amazon for the COP summit, or, you know, the endless private jets. If you make it look like it's just a kind of fad for the political elites that seems to only punish the little guy, then you've guaranteed that it's not going to be taken seriously. And not least because if those pushing this ideology cared as much as they say they do, then the stated and revealed preferences would not be such worlds away from each other.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that what has been the case has been that the ardour of people who wanted to ensure that we recognise the environmental damage that mankind was generating. Their ardour meant that some of them embraced, some with fervour, others perhaps more reluctantly, the idea that everything had to be subordinated to the goal of reaching net zero at a pace, at a rate, which could only become faster and more urgent. So it wasn't enough to say that you get rid of internal combustion engines by 2040. We had to make sure that it was electric vehicles by 2035, by 2030. And
it was interesting how every British major party positioned itself with each other in mind. So the Tories began with 2050. I think Jeremy Corbyn was talking about 2030 or 2035.
Yes.
The Lib Dems were saying 2040 because they are the middle ground between Tory and Labour. It had absolutely nothing to do with science, what was achievable, what was practical. It was all about vibes and I'm better than these guys, but not as mad as these guys.
And this is one of the things that worries me. And I think this is probably an area where we will have differences. I do recognise that on both net zero and lockdown, that the proponents of both enacted policies that were almost Cromwellian in their zealotry. Now we have a repudiation of both.
I don't know. I'd say they were pretty similar to Cromwell.
Exactly. Now we have a repudiation of both. Well, we can maybe talk about lockdown in a future episode.
Absolutely.
We shan't now. However,
whenever you like, Michael. Whenever you like.
Okay, we will. But on net zero, I do believe that it is the case that there are concerns that we should have about climate change, and more particularly, I believe that there are broader environmental concerns that really matter. I particularly worry about how nature denuded the United Kingdom is. I particularly worry about the loss of habitats, the damage to biodiversity. Hate the phrase, but love the concept. And one of the things that worries me is that we risk moving from a situation where any questioning of every aspect of climate change theology was regarded as heresy, to one where in people's anxiety to escape from that Puritan straitjacket, there is no thought or no concern expressed about the environment, and that we move to a situation where nature creation is just thought to be a set of commodities to be exploited, and that sort of broader concern isn't there. So I am very, very happy to acknowledge that I was part of a government and intimately involved in, for example, seeking to get the COP conference to come to Glasgow, because I believe that it was helpful for the UK to be involved in that conversation, and that maybe we should have been a little bit more rigorous and sceptical in challenging some of the claims that were made around that conference and by our government. But what I would hate to think is that legitimised a rejection overall of the need to think about the environmental damage that economic growth can bring in its wake.
I think that this is a very valid concern, but I'm afraid that I think that government policy of the last few years has really not helped with this, because there was an extraordinary amount of goodwill towards the proposals when they first came in, because I actually think Britain is a country that cares very much about what I would say kind of small c conservatism, you know, kind of Scrutonian, cares very deeply about the quality of water, about the beauty of the countryside, recycling, etc. And you probably have people who, without even meaning to deliberately, have lived an extremely green life. People who probably kind of similar to my parents, they don't go on abroad holidays very often. They are absolutely devoted to their kind of vegetable patch and their compost heaps and looking after the wildlife and caring for the hedgehogs and all that jazz. that is all very legitimate and decent. And then on the other hand, you have this great top-down moral crusade of net zero, which basically says we're going to sign up to a target that's in the future. We have no idea if the technology exists to make this possible or not, but we are going to shackle. It's framed as something that is done in a kind of Burkean way with like future generations in mind. But what we have just done is we have shackled future generations to something that we don't know if it's even possible. And I worry that in that kind of zeal, you sort of, to use a horrible political cliche, you kind of make the perfect the enemy of the good. You know, we do need to be green, but it has to be compatible with a modern free market economy. We can't do the hair shirtism of Greta Thunberg and kind of go back to a pre-industrial time. It has to be, and there are ways to do this, you know, I think we've been investing and prioritizing the wrong things.
Yes.
So how much have we spent on, for example, I don't know, solar power in Britain? Imagine if we had directed the amount of money that we've directed towards turbines and panels. And I'm not saying that they don't work somewhat, but imagine if we'd put all that money into nuclear, what position we'd be in now.
If you look at the outworkings of the drive to decarbonise our economy, then all sorts of legitimate concerns were set to one side in order to, and continue to be set to one side in order to meet that goal. So we give up productive farmland, we lose beautiful landscapes in order to have solar and wind farms.
We become very reliant on China through the production of these mechanisms.
Correct. I mean, I personally think that you shouldn't call solar arrays and you shouldn't call wind generation farms. In itself, it's an appropriation of the word in order to cloak one policy with the romance of another. But you put your finger on the biggest concern, which is that Britain's solar industry has been devastated by China. China is dominant in producing photovoltaic cells and producing the components of wind power, in producing electric vehicles. And Ed Miliband argues that we need to move away from fossil fuels in order to remove our reliance on unreliable petrostates like Russia. But we're supplanting that with reliance on an unreliable slave state, which is China.
Yes.
And so it's balancing these considerations. I mean, it
is really difficult. You know,
yes.
I don't envy anybody that had to actually make policy during this time, because you can't please all of the people all of the time and you have quite an impossible balancing act on your hand. But I just feel like it's a caution against being a zealot in one direction or another. I
used the probably inelegant analogy of a penny farthing to describe this government's approach towards the environment. And I said that there was so much focus on net zero. That was like the huge wheel at the front, and a tiny focus on nature, that it was an inherently unbalanced approach towards the environment. And I would still say that what we need, and the Spectator magazine will be looking at this, is a proper scientific analysis of each of the component parts of the net zero chain, as it were, not to try to discredit forever the idea of man-made climate change, because you can't, because that is scientifically, I think, a proven. The greenhouse gas effect is proven. But to look at the way in which, from that particular point, an edifice has been built where descent from each of the links in the chain has been considered to be heretical. So any attempt to say, for example, well, we know that actually that man-made activity creates emissions, but is the IPCC, the body that makes predictions, is it right? Are its models correct? Can you model changes in the climate so far in advance? If it is the case that you're trying to, is there any other field where you can make predictions about a complex system so far in advance and then use it to make decisions about our economy now that we absolutely know will reduce economic growth and stifle innovation? And I think that the attempt by some to say, "Oh, you're a denier," you are either in the grip of right-wing ideology or fossil fuel money or whatever, gets in the way of a proper analysis of the trade-offs you mentioned.
There's also something quite parochial about our green policy, which is basically each country looks only at their own emissions.
Quite.
And we especially have gone through policies which have been crippling to many households.
Yes.
And have continued to make energy bills much higher than they would be naturally without government intervention. So, immiserating some families through this policy. And meanwhile, other countries, bigger countries, carry on and fill their boots. There's a thinker called Bjorn Lomborg who's, I think, very interesting in this. He basically says that he makes the fairly obvious point, but one that many people seem not to notice at all, that the universe is fairly agnostic as to where the emissions come from,
yes.
whether England or China or India, and that actually you may get more bang for your buck by spending money in another country. Let's say there's a country that's producing a lot of coal, rather than killing ourselves to become completely reliant on renewables. You might actually do better to pump some money into getting countries off coal who might be on a different, cleaner form of energy.
Completely. So you're absolutely right that the whole COP process determines a country's virtue on the basis of the emissions that it is responsible for itself, the NDCs and so on. What it doesn't measure is the extent to which a country may be reliant on others' emissions. And the brilliant Oxford economist Dieter Helm has made that point very effectively. But also in this week's Spectator, Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, draws a broader set of comparisons, and he makes the point that the deindustrialization, which the drive towards net zero has generated in this country, the drive to make sure that you reduce carbon emissions, has led to high energy prices. That deindustrialization actually harms our national security, and as well as our reliance on China, it is the case that we're in a economically and strategically weaker position overall. And Richard Dearlove would not be writing that from the point of view of someone whose whole career has been dedicated to national security, unless he felt that there were real risks. And whatever the motivation of the Chinese government, I do not believe that the Chinese government is acting out of compassion for the entire globe. It's acting from geostrategic imperatives that are about dominance. So the debate overall has to be informed by an appreciation of the impact on economic growth domestically, and the fact that if we, as you say, deliberately seek to make ourselves the most climate virtuous country on earth, the people who are most delighted are not future generations. The people who are most delighted are the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party.
Dieter Helm is really interesting on this as well, because he's a economist at the University of Oxford.
Yes.
And he's been what he's done that's really interesting is basically busted some of the common talking points. And again, he is not someone that you can just dismiss as some crank, much as they would like to. This is a very eminent economist who's got a terrific reputation. Well, but he's been his point that I think has been really persuasive is basically explaining how the headline figure of how much green energy costs is a complete lie.
Quite.
Because it fails to factor in the amount of government subsidy that went into creating that grid and subsidising it at times when, for example, renewables are intermittent. And actually, the true figure is worlds away from the figure that is often used in debates. And I see a lot of MPs, Labour in particular, but of all parties, championing. And they say unthinkingly that it's cheaper because of this headline figure.
And he makes the telling point that if it was so much cheaper, then it wouldn't have required so much subsidy in the first place. And of course, it's cheaper because we're buying it from China, and then of course China is selling it much in the way that a drug dealer provides his product initially for free in order to get us hooked, and then ramps up the price or whatever exercises control over us. And Dieter Helm, while he is a brilliant an analyst of markets, is not a pigeonholable economist, and in fact he's done extensive work on how you can promote biodiversity, how the economy can become greener overall, how you can deal with waste in a more sustainable way. And in a straightforward battle between who's actually done more for the environment in this country, Dieter Helm or Ed Miliband, then it's Dieter Helm 10-0. Every week is Nazi week for some in the media, as well as the new movie Nuremberg, in which Russell Crowe plays Goring in the dock. Channel 4 have also released a new documentary, Hitler's DNA, Blueprint of a Dictator, in which the main revelation is that Hitler had a rare genetic disorder which prevents people from going through puberty properly or completely. The documentary suggests that he had an undescended testicle and a micro penis as a consequence. And the documentary also says that Hitler had psychiatric and neurodevelopmental conditions, which meant that he had a higher than likely average likelihood of ADHD. I don't know about you, Maddie. I can understand. I love history, and I'm fascinated by the factors that drove historical figures to act as they did. But I find this attempt to reduce everything to thwarted sexuality, mental illness, and other factors actually a distraction from the fact that it's the moral culpability of historical figures and their ideology which is the most important thing. But am I being too, what's the word, crusty?
I don't think so. I mean, for a start, they've interestingly, the way they were able to come to this analysis is that I think an American GI, when they were finally entering the bunker in Berlin, found the sofa where Hitler and Eva Braun had shot themselves, and of course it was covered in blood. An American GI cuts a square off the sofa, which is bloodstained, and they're able to analyse this so many years after the event and come to this conclusion. It's all very interesting, and they've decided that he suffered from something called Kalman syndrome, which I think led to some of these medical complications that you mentioned. But I can't help but thinking of surely all the other people that suffer with Kalman syndrome but manage not to invade Poland and kill millions of people.
Yes.
So on the one hand, it is quite reductive. At the very least, it should be part of the overall tapestry of reasons why a man like Hitler is able to take power and do the things that he does. But personally, I love history too. I've always found, of all the dictators, Hitler perhaps one of the least interesting psychologically. You know, he's evil, but we sort of know why he's evil. He's, as well as the preponderance of anti-Semitism in Europe at that time, you know, he's evil, bitter, twisted, incapable of forming relationships. He hates the world and is aggrieved that he hasn't done better out of it. And it also, he is a product of his time in the sense that he swallows a lot of those ideas that are very popular in late sort of 19th century intellectual thought. You know, the occult, some of that crazy skull measuring,
yes,
that kind of like the scientific racism, basically all that boring late Victorian stuff that middle class people come up with when they have too much time on their hands. And he just absorbs all of these ideas. Personally, I'm more interested in someone like Stalin, for example, or Bonaparte. You know, these are monsters, but there's more psychological interest, perhaps.
I think that's almost certainly true. I think you're right that the most interesting thing about what happened in 1930s Germany is the intellectual stew, if intellectual is the right word, from which Nazism emerged. And I think looking back at scientific racism, how it took hold in Germany, people like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, how the philosophy, he was Wagner's son-in-law, how the philosophy of the war between races, this evolutionary war, which the German people had to win by vanquishing their opponents in order to establish hegemony. How, looking at that set of ideas, how they grabbed hold not just of Hitler, but of German elites in the aftermath of the Second World War, and how also they were current in other countries from, you know, Belgium to Romania. That, I think, is more interesting and a more profound warning than simply looking at the DNA quirks of Hitler or the inadequacy of his personality.
It's a rather Freudian analysis.
Yes.
It's a bit too simple, perhaps.
Precisely. And it reduces villainy and evil to something that is genetically determined rather than morally chosen or intellectually influenced. And I think it's the influence of ideas on people's minds that is both more fascinating and also a better warning. I also agree with you that in understanding evil and the will to power, Stalin and Napoleon, and for that matter Mao, partly because of their relative longevity in power. And remember, both Stalin and Mao died while still in office.
Yes.
I think that is a more fascinating and more profound warning overall. And, that's why, even though Hitler and the Nazis stand out as a unique evil, that this sort of focus on him, I think, is slightly mistaken. It almost turns him into a sort of Marvel villain.
Yeah.
Because the Marvel villains are all individuals who have some sort of genetic quirk or some accident at some point in their life that takes them down a path of evil.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes him cartoonish and to an extent also risible, rather than the product of a set of ideas that were wicked, but at the same time captured the minds of so many.
I think I agree with that. Hitler is a monstrous figure, but to me, even amongst the Nazis, a particularly low rent figure, less psychologically interesting. I honestly would say that Goering, Himmler, Goebbels are more fascinating from that perspective. I mean, you mentioned the film Nuremberg. I haven't seen it yet, but that's about how Goering enjoyed playing mind games with his defense lawyer at his trial. So from that aspect, interesting. I mean, I do understand why, and there is part of me that's a bit suspicious when I hear of these bold new theses, because when you're dealing with a historical figure about which a great deal has already been said, you maybe need something original to make your thesis stand out. And this is not like, I think, not to attack the integrity of this. I mean, the science behind this is really fascinating. It's by the Professor Turi King, who is the lady who helped helped to prove that the body that they thought might be Richard III was indeed him through analysis of descendants. So it's extraordinary science, but it's almost like we shouldn't over-interpret what it tells us or set too much store in a kind of deterministic fashion.
Yes, no, I think that is a fair point, that one shouldn't dismiss new discoveries that science enables us to make about figures from the past, and they can provide additional context. So it is fair. You're probably right, I'm a wee bit too sniffy about it, but I agree more powerfully with your point that overall there were others who were involved in these atrocities whose personalities and motivations repay scrutiny. And funnily enough, the thing which I've read, which I found most fascinating about what went on during that period, is not a history, but a novel. And a novel which is based on what might seem to be an almost impossible act, which is to think yourself into the mind of a Nazi. It's a novel called The Kindly Ones by a writer called Jonathan Little. It's a very flawed book, but it is fascinating because what it seeks to do is to understand the motivation of a young man who is a willing, occasionally cynical, but certainly ardent believer in the Germany of the 1930s and 40s. And by trying to break down the motivation and the beliefs of someone who was not just a collaborator, but a willing implementer of those policies, you realize both the full horror of them, but you also see that this is not something that is alien. It is not the case that you need to have a genetic disorder that makes you an outlier in biological terms in order to embrace this evil, that they were, in the words of the historian Christopher Browning, ordinary men.
Yes. Some of the best films that I have seen that are still breaking new ground, which it is possible to do, are ones that look for a new perspective on the atrocities of the Holocaust. So there's a film called Son of Saul, which is from the perspective of a member of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz itself. And the film follows him as he goes about it's told from his perspective, and you go right into the most unimaginable horrors. And there's also a film that came out more recently, The Zone of Interest. Have you seen The Zone of Interest?
Yes, which is based on the Martin Amis novel.
Yes.
And it's about the commandant at Auschwitz and looks at the domestic reality of his life, even as the most horrendous evil is being perpetrated just over the wall.
The use of sound editing in that film is unbelievable, because it creates, there's this constant kind of low level, sometimes higher level sound that emanates from the camps itself. And it sort of invades the house, which is adjoining it, right next to it. And they created it with, absolute authenticity, just how close they would have been. So you have children playing outside and then you'll hear a scream or a gunshot. It cannot be avoided, but nevertheless, the family do their best to, and, the smell, obviously you can't evoke that through sound, but they do their best to basically live in this bizarre little bubble amid the most unimaginable horror, and bringing up children in that environment too. And it tells you so much about how people are able to dissociate from things around them. A bit like in the film Shoah, there's that famous scene, Claude Lanzmann's documentary, there's that famous scene when they speak to a man who drove a train into Auschwitz, and he talks about how he speaks in impersonalized language. He just talks about, I got there and I dropped off my cargo, or the cargo, not explaining what the cargo is, which is, of course, thousands of people who are soon to be killed.
I think you're right, Maddie. I think it is far more fascinating, chilling, and, if anything, a more effective warning to look at the lives of people like you and I at a time like that, rather than looking at the exceptional, arguably freakish case of one individual. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening, and join us next week for Quite Right.